I'll be very quick. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to those of you who weren't here earlier today. Welcome to those of you who've come back, and thank you for doing that. I'm one of the clergy here in Chartwell Cooperating Parish, and I'm a stand-in for Aaron. As I explained this afternoon, Aaron Bennett is the person behind bringing Professor Bessler here, and he's cruising somewhere in the Pacific. It just happened that that was planned long before this opportunity arose, and he's a bit of a split personality at the moment, so I'm standing in on his behalf. Welcome to Chartwell, and if there's a little bit of activity, you need to understand that there is a garden club meeting in the hall. There are Girls' Brigade parents arriving to pick their children up, and I may just have to stand out there and direct traffic for a couple of minutes. So, kia ora. Sitting behind me, hiding in the chair, is Joseph Bessler. Joseph is a professor of theology at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We already had the stimulation earlier today of having him explore, and I love the way you did it. He had these 6 models, and he gradually sort of moved. We talked about 6 models of faith emerging from the Jesus Seminar. And this evening, the topic is a little different, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, because that would spoil the surprise. So, Joseph, at the end of 4 weeks in Australia, has moved over the ditch. He will be offering seminars in Auckland, starting tomorrow and going through until Sunday morning. And we've been able to be blessed by having his presence here with us today. So thank you for coming, and I know you will be suitably engaged. That'll do, won't it? You'll do the rest.
Thanks, Gloria. Okay. Thanks, Gloria. Are we back? Alec, you just boost my volume as you need to there. I appreciate your help. Thanks to Warwick and Jan for a lovely dinner. Thank you for the hospitality that you all have shown me, and I appreciate that, and Laura, just very much. So we are delightedly in your debt, so thank you. Tonight, the title of this talk is called The Virtues of a Questionable Faith. And it's a bit more of an autobiographical talk. So I begin to give some of my own kind of movement and development of my own journey. And I'm doing that in part because I hope that as I'm sharing something of my journey that you'll be imagining moments and transitions in your own understanding and your own commitments. And thereby perhaps enrich our conversation afterward. So I'll go ahead and get started. Into the 1950s, most Christian denominations of various stripes would agree on a common conviction that they were trying to bring Christ to the world, or bringing the world to Christ in a kind of, there being a kind of conversion model, and also a sense of that classical model of theology of still a more divine or eternal presence of God vis-a-vis this temporal world. This assumption went hand in glove with the colonial imperial aspirations of Western powers throughout much of the 19th and 20th century. We can talk more about that, and if you like, in the break. But those Western colonial assumptions began to break down in the wake of World War I, as well as more decisively then in the wake of World War II. Langdon Gilkey and others in the late 1950s and early 60s, Gilkey being a student of Paul Tillex's and of Reinhold Niebuhr's, began realizing that something was amiss with these supernatural assumptions. Philosophical existentialism had sounded the alarm, and theologians like Paul Tillich worked at reframing theology in ontological, and by ontological I mean a unified theory of being rather than a two-tier theory of the eternal and the temporal, or the supernatural and the natural. But there was also growing suspicion that Christian confidence in bringing salvation to the world was a mistake, and one linked to those Western colonial interests. The Holocaust, or Shoah, revealed the roots of Christian anti-Jewishness as enabling Hitler's final solution. The knowledge and use of nuclear weapons made us aware that the end of the earth might lay more in our hands than in God's. The civil rights movement in the United States called attention to how Christians had supported slavery and segregation, even as black Christians were risking their lives for freedom. Women were beginning to realize that their own voices had been silenced, in part due to Christian doctrines of God as an Almighty Father and a Savior Son as well. And in former colonies all around the world, religious traditions and movements that had been suppressed by Christian colonizers began to reemerge. I was born into that world in 1956. As I was thinking about this talk, I remembered a sermon that famous process theologian John Cobb delivered when he came to Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa about 8 to 10 years ago. I think he was 90 at the time, and I was just astounded by his remarks. Because in the sermon, he spoke not of his significant achievements in process theology or in his career. Instead, he spoke confessionally of moments in his own professional life where, using the image from Acts 9:1-19, the scales fell from his eyes and his sight was transformed. In those moments, he was turned around. In the sermon, he speaks of how he came to see the profound sinfulness of Christian anti-Jewishness, of Christian hatred of women or misogyny, of Christian participation in the abuse of the earth, which he would go and write on at length in much of the rest of his career, as well as the Christian oppression of GLBTQI persons. And as he told each of those stories, we saw him coming to terms with that blindness, as well as the transformation of his voice, now as a significant advocate on those same issues. I turned to Cobb's sermon because his confession reminds me of my own journey as a white, male theologian coming to grips with others' voices that I'd not paid attention to, including the voice of the earth itself. I think Cobb's confession asked me to embrace a new kind of humility, an acknowledgement that my own privileged view is not the center, is not the norm. But as David Tracy, one of my other great, marvelous teachers, put it, that we are part of a wider conversation that demands more listening of me than speaking. And so my title, The Virtues of a Questionable Faith, is an attempt to situate my own moments of growth as a person and as a theologian, as a process in which I have found myself called to move beyond the boundaries of the more sure and certain faith in which I was raised, into more questionable areas. A faith that questions faith, and a faith, therefore, which can seem very questionable to others. And yet I have come to believe that we must keep leaving home. We must keep leaving the yard that we have come to know, and to risk our lives and our faith in ever-widening circles that will change us, where we are not simply changing others, but we ourselves are being changed. I have difficulty separating my personal faith from my theological journey, precisely because my theological journey has been wedded so deeply to my own experience and understanding of faith. My faith has been nurtured by books as part of my own experience, and the widely varying perspectives of those books have changed both my imagination and my convictions. Without the books and many writers and teachers who have entered my life, I would not have grown in the same way. The processes of education, of a marvelous education, have been vital to my own life, and I have become convinced that strengthening public commitments to education all the way down the line is absolutely central to a progressive faith. Without education, we might not grow in wonder or in curiosity. We might not grow in imagination or empathy. We might never learn the patience of conversation on difficult and trying issues. So I want to begin by sharing a few stories from my childhood and then moving a little bit into young adulthood in order to show how I began to move from the faith of my childhood to something of a wider world opened up by my teachers. As I say to my Protestant students when I begin each class that I teach in constructive theology at Phillips, my parents didn't want me hanging out with the likes of you. For the very best of reasons, to guide me in the way of the true faith. My very religious Catholic parents wanted me to have good Catholic friends. We went, of course, to Catholic schools to be nurtured in a faith that God would sustain us and that God would help hold our family together in good times and in bad. My parents' plan of protection, which notice is a powerful and important parental impulse across cultures and faiths, began to be challenged from the inside out because my Catholic nuns and teachers and priests, as opposed to my parents and my older siblings, had been deeply influenced, and happily so, by the new teaching of what was going on in the Catholic Church at that time, Vatican II, which had begun around 1958-59, concluding around 1965, and which sought to open up the church to the modern world. My parents and even my older siblings had grown up in a much more traditional church, the Mass in Latin, authority-focused, obedience-focused. Neither of my parents had finished college. They had been teenagers and young adults through the Depression and through the war. They met and married during the war. They knew the necessity of hard work and sacrifice. As parents, they believed in strict discipline. They spanked my older siblings. I think they were worn out by the time they got to me, who was number 7. I remember overhearing their conversations with church friends over the years in which they lamented the increase of permissive child-rearing practices. And they lamented as well the 1964 Supreme Court decisions outlawing, as they put it, teacher-led prayer and Bible reading in public schools. To be sure, we were not going to public schools, we were going to Catholic schools. But Dad and Mom saw this as a worrying trend that God was not being listened to in our world. In grade school, however, I had Catholic teachers who, thanks to Vatican II, were able to talk about faith and religion in relation to public and political life, not just with the respect to the election of the first U.S. Catholic president, John Kennedy, in 1960, but also with respect to civil rights, celebrating the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. There's a real bundling of cultural events that are happening at right that time. My teachers developed exchange programs for the first time between our almost completely white suburban school and a more inner-city black Catholic congregation school. They wanted to nurture cross-racial friendships. And I enjoyed those experiences, but my parents were more reserved. Issues of race were difficult for them to sort out, and they didn't think of race as a religious issue, but as a political one. So when I was a 12-year-old attending baseball practice on the evening of April 4th in 1968, and I learned of Dr. King's death by assassination, I rode home on my bike to tell my parents, and my father's response upon hearing the news was to say rather matter-of-factly, "Well, Joe, I think he was a communist." To be sure, he was not alone in that. The FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, had been trying to undermine King's own sense of call to transformation, but to undermine King's mission itself with just that kind of claim. But I remember stunned, thinking to myself, that's not what Sister Mary Andre thinks. Her voice was an intra-Catholic. In other words, a voice within the Catholic community, arguing for a more open dialogue with the world. Now, my parents, both of whom are now deceased, my father dying last year at 101, nurtured my faith in many rich and profound ways. But with respect to these issues of social and political justice, my teachers would become my intellectual and moral parents. My teachers opened that imaginative leap for me. Faith was not just about eternal life, but issues of justice in public life. And a second example now from high school, I came into contact with more Catholic teachers who were influenced not just by Vatican II, but by biblical scholarship that emphasized the humanity of Jesus, and which sought to understand faith in more horizontal terms, engaging this world rather than the vertical terms of classical theology with its language of ascent from the temporal to the eternal. This was the age of Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell, but also of the new quest for the historical Jesus, which we talked about this afternoon, which began in 1953, but was catching on in theology in the 1960s and 70s. That scholarly quest helped us imagine the humanity of Jesus as every bit essential to faith, and perhaps more so than the classical emphasis on the divinity of Jesus. And in this way, again, my faith was being turned, reoriented towards the world. The new quest, with its emphasis on Jesus' humanity and location amidst the poor, helped not only my teachers, but feminist and liberationist theologians argue for the importance of understanding what theologian Anne Carr described as a God who is involved in transformation. The emphasis on the humanity of Jesus in the midst of the poor and in the midst of resistance, provided a sense of real empowerment in theological calls for the transformation of society. This process of opening up my embedded faith to the more human world would lead me to a study and embrace of political and feminist and liberationist thought, and later, when I was at Harvard, at GLBTQI theologies. With each of these theologies by Catholics and Protestants and Jews, I was leaving the yard of a more conservative faith. In my studies at Northwestern University in rhetorical criticism, at Harvard Divinity School in courses on Paul and the historical Jesus with teachers like Dieter Georgi, a wonderful New Testament scholar, and at the University of Chicago in studies of hermeneutics with David Tracy, I was also being equipped to better understand, but also to question Christian traditions more pointedly. In those studies of rhetoric related to persuasion and hermeneutics, I was learning both the importance and the methods for reinterpreting our Western faith traditions into a contemporary discourse concerned about this world, socially, scientifically, politically, economically. And these voices of political and ecological theology pressed me further. For now the domains of the religious and the political were coming to meet one another in prophetic calls for liberation and justice. By the time of my doctoral studies, I no longer understood myself as a Catholic, but more as a progressive Catholic Protestant mix. I didn't think I needed to disown the journey that had itself changed me, but I found myself at profound odds with the Catholic Church's teaching on sexuality, on its failure to ordain women, and of course, with the Church's own inability to confront its horrific history of sexual abuse of children. I can't really tell you how important a moment it is that Cardinal Pell is standing trial in Australia today. It's of profound significance. And notice what is developing in these feminist, womanist, liberationist, post-colonial theologies. They are not simply reinterpreting Christian tradition into our cultural context, but they're also willing to identify elements of Christian tradition, including the topic of God and the understanding of God, as part of the problem which contemporary theology needs to address. For example, a neo-Orthodox theologian like Canadian figure Douglas John Hall identifies Christianity's tendency to triumphalism, and always to a kind of triumphalistic view of itself, as a central problem that contemporary theology needs to address. One thinks of feminist theologies criticizing the maleness of God, Mary Daly's biting critique, as long as God's a male, all males are gods, and the reinterpretation of God in Sally McFague's work as mother, lover, friend. I think of James Cone assailing the whiteness of God as authorizing slavery and insisting instead on God as black. And so I was beginning to see how deeply symbolic the language of God was, how it was not politically innocent, but politically loaded, authorizing power over others. And so much of my life as a professor of theology has been spent observing and teaching about the implications of this knowledge for faith, of how this knowledge calls us to keep leaving the safety of our own yards, in which a more traditional faith was often kind of embedded within us. Imagining others' lives, women's lives, colonized people's lives, enslaved lives, political and economically abused lives, governed as it were by white male Christian authorities, is a powerful call to repent. The liberationist and feminist language of systemic sin rather than original sin proved helpful to me. Systems that silenced them, that silenced their educations, their career goals, that fostered an internalized sense of shame, of being less than, for many folks who were GLBTQI. While those same systems structured privileges for me that encouraged a gendered and cultured sense of superiority. And the assumptions that these structures and systems were authorized and blessed by God, well, it wasn't pleasant to look at that. It still isn't pleasant to look at that. And there is that sense of scales falling from my eyes as I began to acknowledge our responsibility, my responsibility, for how to speak of God, for how I speak of God. I think as well of Gordon Kaufman's work of Theology in a Nuclear Age, in which he argued it was irresponsible for theologians and church officials to speak of the omnipotence of God when we had the capacity to end life on this planet in our hands, in nuclear weapons. That assertion of divine power, he argued, is not simply naive, but irresponsible. To be sure, most of these theological movements, liberationist and feminist and ecological theologies, were not setting God aside, but they're powerful reinterpretations of God which authorized their proposals for real changes in theology and religious life, raise the awareness of our responsibility, of my responsibility, for how we speak of God. So I'm now, as you can imagine, a long way from home. And from the perspective of those who have not made this journey, my faith can seem quite questionable. I wrote my book, A Scandalous Jesus, How Three Historic Quests Changed Theology for the Better, in this awareness. And with my discussion of each of the three quests, the 19th century quest, the new quest, and the Jesus Seminar, I showed how theologians used the topic of the historical Jesus to leverage transformations in both church and society. In other words, biblical scholars and theologians were using the historical Jesus to call both the church and society to open their eyes to new cultural situations and new realities. Each quest called for the rethinking of Christian doctrine in order to open up the church to wider intellectual and moral conversations, vis-a-vis science, vis-a-vis democracy, vis-a-vis other religions. And I was particularly moved in my work with Westar, that's the parent organization of the Jesus Seminar, by the creative focus on the destabilizing character of Jesus' parables. the turn to language in the focus of the Jesus seminar would prove to be another shift, drawing me out yet again. Yes, I'll just go ahead and read some of this list. There's from here on in, my thought gets a little bit more philosophical in terms of the folks I'm going to engage. So just kind of hang in there with me on this. Influenced in part by Martin Heidegger, philosopher, mid-century philosopher, his more explicit shift to the study of language, as epitomized in his famous phrase, "Language is the house of being," from his 1947 letter on humanism. Philosophers including Ludwig Wittgenstein with the whole notion of language games, Hans-Georg Gadamer and Paul Ricoeur in the area of hermeneutics, Claude Lévi-Strauss in the area of structuralism, Richard Rorty in the language of neo-pragmatism, Jacques Derrida in the area of deconstruction, Kenneth Burke in the area of rhetoric, Michel Foucault in the analysis of power. All of these figures, writing again in a real condensed period of time, help reshape the landscape of biblical and theological studies beyond the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s and 90s. For many of these theorists, human experience was not available as a kind of pre-linguistic given, as if to say you had experience and then applied language to it. Rather, experience itself was always already formed within the web of language. Derrida's phrase, "there is nothing outside the text," pointed anew to the constructed character of human knowledge, and hence the need to deconstruct the pretensions of philosophies and theologies that claim to know or have access to a founding presence outside of language. Let me give you another sense of that. So Derrida is relying on the work of a French structuralist thinker named Fernand de Saussure, who died in like 1906. And it was Saussure's analysis of language where he says, you know, we often think that language is transparent to being. So the word tree points to the word tree, or the word chair points to the word chair. He said, that's not the case at all. He said, rather, the signs that we use in language are themselves arbitrary. They do not point. One learns them whatever language we learn, or the multiple languages we learn because we as learners come to differentiate between tree and thee and be and free, and the way in which words kind of spin off. But they do not point to a sure or certain ground, right? And that, therefore, is going to mean that at the base of language, when one takes this understanding of language seriously, at base, we do not have access to certainty, to sureness, to foundations. Rather, what we have is a sense of uncertainty. And it's that uncertainty which provides the creativity of language, of metaphor, and ultimately of the meanings and the different meanings we construct. Recently, I found the work of philosophical theologian John Caputo, who I am really grateful for because he's made the work of Jacques Derrida somewhat intelligible to me. Every time I would go to pick up the work of Derrida, I would be just kind of put off by how difficult the reading of his text could be. Caputo is just a wonderful, he was a friend of Derrida's, but interpreter, and he's really made that work accessible. A couple of texts that might be helpful to you if you wanted to try that was his book, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? This is Caputo. Another one I've picked up that I really think is very helpful is his book called Hope Against Hope. But hang in there with me as I kind of introduce you to some of his thought, which has really been now influential on me. So I've really found the work of John Caputo to be particularly helpful in thinking about uncertainty as a presupposition for a current understanding and practice of faith. That there is no pure speech that occurs apart from context and interests and cultural systems, and thus no getting back to the sure presence of an origin or of an absolute beginning can be deeply destabilizing, and a very disturbing thought. And that is what it needs to be, according to Caputo, in order to kind of break through our own kind of common sense assumptions. Because undoing our ideologies of certainty, especially ones grounded in an all-powerful supernatural God, deconstructing that premise of presence can really reopen our capacity to respond to others, he argues, in far more generous ways. Instead of focusing on origins, Caputo asks us to focus on our experience of what he calls events that are unexpected, that interrupt and break into our own sense of cultural everydayness. Such events, which can appear as both threatening and life-giving, and often simultaneously so, awaken us from our own slumber in everydayness, our own sense of how life goes, and to our capacity to respond to life. So it jars us into that, awakening the responsibility that lies at the heart of human life, calling forth our courage to be with and for others as well as for ourselves. So Caputo is engaging in this sense of uncertainty with a sense of opening up our own sense of both ethical and spiritual responsibility. Such events, he says, can be personally life-changing. The birth of a child, a marriage or divorce, one's own experience of a great teacher, the risk of one's life for another, or the moment of experiencing another's heroism or fear of life. They might also be moments in the life of a culture, 9/11, the civil rights movement, profound discoveries of space, or deep economic recessions that both threaten and inspire our participation in life. Such moments, such events, in both their threatening and promising character, illuminate our human tendencies to seek safety on the one hand and to embrace danger on the other. For Caputo, such events, especially what he will call the event of God, and the profound suffering, tears, and prayers that accompany it, call forth in Paul Tillich's phrase, the courage to be, which is always the risk of faith in the midst of uncertainty. Caputo writes, "I pray the God who exposes me to trouble, to rid me of the God who keeps me safe, who functions as a guarantor of tranquility and order." Why does Caputo pray such a prayer? In his prayer to be rid of the God who keeps me safe and who functions as a guarantor of tranquility and order, Caputo begins to sketch the contours of the problem. To the eyes of more traditional confessional faith, my own included, his prayer seems ridiculous. Don't we pray God that God will keep us safe when we are in danger? Isn't that precisely when we need to feel God's presence? Yet Caputo pushes the question, what kind of God is it who promises to keep me safe? And what is it that God asks of me in order to keep me safe? The real problem with this confessional model of God, according to Caputo, is that it trades in claims of certainty and therefore promises what it cannot deliver. From countless experiences amidst our own lives and observing others' lives, we see that the most ardent prayer does not keep us from suffering. The model of God as a supernatural being who protects on the one hand and threatens on the other is not, he says, finally, a just one. But more insidious is what the model of God asks of us. To stay safe, don't ask any questions. Believe in the doctrine as it is told to you. It's the theological version of the art of the deal. Caputo likes being provocative in that sense. You praise me, I protect you. The problem with this model of God and this model of faith is that it teaches us to hide from life, he says, to be suspicious of others who are different, and to hide not only from them but from ourselves. Are there moments in life to be concerned about our safety? Of course, but that should not be our way of life. For Caputo, God understood as a being, as a ground or the source of being, as the stabilizer of being, does not exist. Rather, he says, God insists. Writing in his 2015 book, Hope Against Hope, Caputo says that the insistence of God means that the name of God is the name of something that lays claim to us unconditionally, like a promise of things that eye has not seen nor ear heard, but without the force of being, of power, of sovereignty, and omnipotence. It means that something calls us unconditionally, but without the power of an economic system or rewards or retributions of any kind, even without a heavenly host of angels to back it up. More interesting than the existence of God, fought over in the positivistic terms of the 19th century, God exists, no, God doesn't exist, yes, God. More important than that is the question, he says, of, quote, what work is getting done under the name of God? I find his insight very helpful here. What work is getting done in the feminist discussion of God, or the liberationists, or the post-colonial? Why are they discussing God in that way? What are they really proposing? What are they calling us towards? God's existence, says Caputo, is up to us. Existing is what we do. Making God's insistence real in the world, that's up to us. Just a bit more on this. While acknowledging with Derrida that language does not get us to the ground of being, to a point of absolute stabilization and certainty, Caputo is clearly not done with God or wrestling with God. In his book, The Weakness of God, he says, what Derrida means by justice is what I mean by God. There is an insistent character to justice, an unconditional character, a call that persists, that does not have a caller behind it. Justice is what we find calling to us in the midst of a variety of social, political, economic times and questions and issues. It does not have a caller behind it, but it persists in a way that questions and calls us to respond. Caputo's thought is quite nuanced here. But even in the midst of faith, he wants to press us to let go of certainty, to let go of the promises of confessional faith, which inevitably, he thinks, shrinks our world and our responsibility for it. Letting go of certainty is crucial, he says, to enabling our capacity to be open and to be responsive to difference. If we can let go of certainty, we might be able to let go of the sureness of our superiority, our moral superiority, our racial, our gender superiority. We might let go of some of our judgmentalism towards others. We might have a more open mind when thinking about ecological or economic or political issues. Uncertainty for Caputo is not only a domain of intellectual honesty, but also a domain of both courage and hope for the sake of justice. Caputo's language helps me to let go of God, to let go of God's existence as if God were a being or a securing power, and thus to let go of my own attempt to grasp, to name, to speak authoritatively about the reality of God. To be sure, I speak of God, but now with a more questionable faith. The edge of the call calls me to decenter myself, not to die, but to live more openly, and to keep breaking out of the enclosures or fears that bind me. Hearing in that calling the call to let go of God, to not hold on to God as an authorizing voice that would stabilize and anchor me, I experience something of an apophatic faith, what the mystics would speak of as a faith of unknowing, of questioning, of radical openness, a moving faith. Once again, I find myself leaving home, but also perhaps coming to a new sense of a home away from home. I'd like to conclude by reading a poem. This is a poem by Glenn Cardy. When we were talking a little bit about John Caputo and Caputo's kind of influence on our ways of thinking, he shared this poem that he included in his bulletin, I think his church bulletin. God is dripping. Drip after drop after drip, incessant, disturbing, haunting, summoning. One day the drip whispers after a prison visit, "Is poverty a crime? Is being brown a felony?" On another day it murmurs, "If we can produce enough to feed the world, why are so many hungry?" God is not a tap. Can't have a drip without a tap, the theists counter. But they miss the point. God doesn't exist. God insists, like an unrelenting drip. For existence pertains to a being, a construction, a noun which attracts other nouns alongside. Best to ignore the drips, those nuisances, those hauntings, best to seek the source and turn them off. But the source is elusive. God doesn't exist, says the new atheist. And yet, why do we still hear a drip? God dripping defies grasping. It's less demanding, more rational to debate the existence of a tap. It's always more rational to avoid the drip, to seek to turn it off, to try to set it aside. But there is in this poem as well a sense of that insistence, that persistence. So I look forward to our conversation. Thanks so very much. Yes.
Was it?
You have to hold it right up to your mouth like this. You do not put it up to your mouth and it'll be heard.
Thank you very much, Alec. Joe, I really appreciate the fact you opened yourself up to your story and could see little nods and things as people resonated with things that you were saying. So there's time now for those of you who would like, if you've got questions or comments you want to make to Joe for a response from him, I'll bring you the microphone and you can let us know what it is and Joe will respond. Yeah. Remember how you hold it, like a pop star.
Yeah, just a quick one.
Sure.
You mentioned something GLBQI. I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, queer, intersex. So it's okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Did you all hear that response from the... I can't run it off like you can, Joe. Any other comment, any other questions?
Yes, there's a question here.
Sorry, Anna.
I guess I'm just thinking about prayer and I guess traditional forms of prayer, praying to God, to a being, or and not to a drip. So I'm wondering about how you pray, or the ways of praying that you do. Yeah.
Right. That might be a little too personal for a theologian, but let me give you a sense of how that might. Because if one looks across those moves of my own kind of journey, for about the last 60 years, then you can see that theology, more progressive forms of theology, have been turning away from a focus on the supernatural and therefore attaining to eternal life, and therefore talking to an eternal, kingly, monarchical being, and really turning more toward a sense that this world matters. And so for the last 60 years, the question you're asking has been a relevant one and a difficult one, because what are we doing in the life of prayer? What are we doing? So within that, there have also been a number of shifts in the way in which people think of God. So when I talk about Caputo, when I focus on that at the end, that's kind of one model. But if one thinks of the classical discussion, then you can think of someone like a Paul Tillich who talked about God as the ground of being in more existential terms, right? But again, here again for him, the language of prayer is in part the internal language of psychology of the self. He loved the discourse with psychology. Faith was very much about a kind of an existential risk. And so prayer itself is more a kind of a longing or an engagement with the holy, with the ground of being, to kind of come to a sense of authentic existence. So prayer has a kind of focus there. For others, there's a kind of panentheistic model of faith that's also become, Marcus Borg, we were talking about that today, Catherine Keller, and by that they mean that God is in the midst of all things, or all things are in the midst of God. What are they trying to get around? Again, that's supernatural language. So for them, there can be an emphasis on the nearness of God, a sense of the presence of God all around us, and that can encourage both a kind of a mystical focus or a kind of meditation. It can also have the sense of a kind of energy that one seeks to tap into, so that I've had a wonderful minister friend of mine who would say to others who were suffering, there are so many people who are praying for you, try to harvest those prayers. Try to tap into those prayers of concern and harvest them, right? It's really a beautiful image. So here again, I'm not trying to dismiss the sense of the importance of prayer or of meditation but I'm also trying to say that what these theologies, and I myself am kind of wrestling with, was how to square that language of prayer with our sense of reality, right? So that's really what I'm trying to get at. Now let's see. Besides the panentheistic, certainly then what Caputo's trying to say, kind of complex language, granted, but that God comes to us through language, right? That God is this insistent character that doesn't have there's not a caller behind the call, but the experience of a call is the sense of sacrality, right? So here again, prayer and practice, I think, is important for how it is our own kind of response and our own desire to be listening to that call. What if in prayer what we're trying to do is listen to that call and listen for that call and how we're being called to engage others? So that's, I think, the way I'd go.
Anyone else want to comment on that, back to Joe or back to Anna? Opens a whole new field, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You want to know? Oh, Josh.
Do you think it is helpful to remember that however we understand God, God has no hands but ours. And it's no use us going into a holy huddle saying, oh God, go and help those poor people in Sudan, or whatever the crisis is at the moment. It's we who have to do it.
I'm not sure I understand that. Could you, I'm just kind of probably missing something here.
Well, there is a quite a common phrase that is used within the church.
Yeah.
That God has no hands but our hands.
Oh, got it. Right.
So I'm talking about theopraxy here.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to think that in the parables, Jesus never mentions the word God, I don't think, but he was a lot about what we had to do, and 300 years later, it was all about what we had to believe.
Yeah. Oh, here. Yes. I think that can be a kind of a healthy corrective, so that again, what really is important, and say again just what you said at the beginning there.
That God has no hands but our hands.
Right, and so it seems to me in some ways that squares with what I was saying. Right? That if you're trying to focus, again, on the reality of this world, which these theologians have been trying and asking us to do over the last 50, 60 years, that part of what then being this kind of more liberal to liberationist to kind of theologian and community, it means that we do seek to be the hands and the presence of God in the world in the way that we can. Now, we had a very interesting discussion earlier today when we were also saying, well, but at our age, and given all that we know that is before us personally and spiritually and physically, we also want to begin to say, well, what are those things that can help us be mindful, whether it's talking to our children, our grandchildren? What can we do to help make our communities mindful of really what the gospel calls us to in this world, the kind of social transformation the gospel calls us to? Can faith begin to be understood in that kind of transformative way? In which case, can we begin to internalize that understanding and say, yes, that's what faith is beginning to ask us to do. So in that sense, I think I would agree exactly with the formation of your question.
I wanted to just continue the conversation about prayer.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether you want to go there. First of all, Anna, yeah. Thank you for picking up the offence in the pun on drip, because it was meant to be an offence, like a crucified God is an offence in Judaism. So it was deliberate in that poem that drip would actually, my God isn't a drip. What do you mean I'm a drip? You know, it's meant to be offensive. And so, and that's, yeah, it's kind of how do we get into these weak metaphors instead of the big, strong metaphors? And I mean, I think Lamb of God is a weak metaphor. It's a vulnerable lamb. I mean, most of us in Kiwi land know about lambs. We've seen lambs. We're about. This is a very weak metaphor.
Yeah.
It's not a mighty soldier on a horse with a sword and all that sort of stuff. So, and then the question of prayer. I think any minister who writes prayers each week, particularly Presbyterian ministers and Methodist ministers I'm talking about here, it's very comforting. Go back to Anglican prayer books, you know. But you know, as we write these prayers, you know, what in the world are we doing? Are we talking to ourselves? God is closer than my breathing, called the Eckhart. And you know, maybe we should just all sit in silence, and then. But that's not enough either. How do we respond to the insistence of what we might call God or justice or whatever? How do we do that corporately as a group of people? Maybe we need to think of prayer as walking. I mean, the great Anglican act of prayer is actually walking forward for communion. Mm-hmm. It's the physical getting up, committing yourself to a sacred act. And that's the redemptive thing to me about Anglican liturgy. But anyway, I can burble on for ages about this thing about prayer, but it's a huge problem for once we go on this faith journey. How do we pray?
Yeah. Well, I actually think that one of the ways in which both Caputo's thought, but not only Caputo's, but much of the last 30 years in progressive theology, it's been asking us to really, in some ways, rethink what it is we're doing when we gather as a congregation, when we gather to pray and we gather to be together. Because I would say this is still, as I was talking in my talk this morning, a profound experience. To gather together, what we're doing is we're practicing what it means to be in real relationships of faith. And so partly what we do is we rehearse prayer language, which rehearses a common language for us, in which we speak about a kind of transcendence that guides our lives and at the same time informs them. And so what we pray for, and often in our prayers, we pray for one another. We pray for those who are sick. We pray for those who are needing our help, as well as we might pray for issues of injustice around the world. So what we do as a community is we try to make ourselves mindful of those things which we, again, as members of a community, want to take seriously. So in some ways, yes, even as we speak to God, we are speaking to one another. We're shaping our own sense of conscience. We're shaping our own sense of the holy. And when we, in fact, then in our language of prayer and practice, what we find ourselves doing in worship is practicing, because we are a public community. We don't simply live in the same house. We live in different households. We gather as church, as a public. And when we do that, we're also then beginning to share what our values are as belonging in this public called the church. And here in the church, we begin to practice communion. We begin to practice respect for one another. We begin to practice listening to one another, what's more deeply on our hearts than we would express in ordinary public life. And so why are we doing that? We are practicing life that we're going to live more publicly outside. Faith is not supposed to stay in the church. That's an old line, but I'm trying to give some new flesh to that. Some new flesh to the sense that what we do in church is really listen to one another, really practice. When we come to communion, for example, we're coming to participate in basic elements of bread and wine and recognizing the presence of God where we least expect in some ways. And then what we need to do is, how do we carry that presence beyond into the world, right? So again, the point of prayer in public, the point of church is important. It's vital to faith, because this is where we practice what it means to be a person of faith, what it means to be a charitable person, what it means to be a just person, what it means to be a person who, as we rehearse in the space of the church, what it means to live authentically in public life. And too often, we simply get used to saying, well, I did that in church, now I'm in public life, and these things don't talk to one another. No, it's not supposed to work that way. What really is supposed to work is the way in which we practice a kind of trust, risking with one another. We risk and engage in real friendships in church. And here is where we begin to learn what it means to have faith in the rest of and engage our public life. So that's the challenge. Church ought to be both a place of nurturing and a place of challenge. Can we live this faith out in the world? And so that's where I think the language of prayer is important. In prayer, we pour out our hearts, right? Well, we hear that in one another. And we need to be hearing that. It's not simply God that needs to be moved. It's we that need to be moved, right? As we often do when someone says they're sick, and then you're making a mental note, let's get a casserole, or let's get some food over to this person, or there's ways in which what we practice as a faith community is also what we then are called to live in the world is called to live more broadly. So I would want to make that connection a stronger one in terms of what we do in church really matters. And that's why it also really matters, I think, to invite people to come to church, because in some sense that's a space where we ourselves have experienced something transformative. And so I think this, again, is an important, vital community.
I was wondering, Joe, when you were talking about language,
yes,
is language connected to, as we see, symbols in our faith? I mean, we've got symbols around the walls now, but not only symbols, but the rituals that we sort of perform.
Yes.
So is there a connection between language, symbols, and ritual? I was wondering.
Sure. Symbols often participate in this kind of the language of analogy, of metaphor, where the symbol is a kind of till it called a symbol, that which participates in the reality to which it points. In other words, it's, and so there's a sense in which ritual is part of this. Well, let me talk about ritual separately, but certainly symbol is a kind of a mystical aspect of language itself, that there is this kind of mystical aspect. Now, with respect to ritual, notice how important and powerful ritual is when we have been going to, say, to communion, or we've been going to church, or we've been participating in a particular ritual like communion for years and years and years. It becomes part of us, right? Ritual is profoundly important for the way in which it can shape us, right? And so, and inform us, and the way in which we can then kind of really become deeply attached to those senses of, to those processes of ritual. The danger with ritual and with church ritual is that it simply stays in church. In other words, we so enter into the ritual, it can become so much simply a personal investment that I fail to kind of keep thinking, oh, this is supposed to inform how I open up to the world. So at points, a danger in ritual can be that it turns us inward over time. But the precise point of a ritual, as it were, in its much more important and affirming sense, is that ritual steeps us in a pattern of activity, of taking a risk, of coming forward, right? Of being together in a community. And it asks us to make that risk, which ideally should translate into the rest of our lives. So what we should learn from ritual is a pattern of engaging the world, not a pattern of retreating from the world. Too often I see ritual as being used to insulate us from the world, and no, it needs to be that which empowers us, precisely because it gives us a form and the confidence of a form to engage. So in that sense, I think ritual is a profound participation in language and symbol. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Oh.
Yes. My feeling is, that it's so much, going back to a little bit what you were talking about earlier, it's a kind of reinforcement of group think. That is, because we are highly social creatures, we feel much more at ease if we're thinking the same way as our fellow humans are thinking. You know, the way that most individuals do not like to get up onto a stage and start talking about something with 100 eyes watching them. We until you get practiced at that sort of thing, you feel very vulnerable.
Yes.
And many people.
Sure.
And these group activities are a way of reinforcing, reassuring ourselves that we're all thinking of the same way. And so we feel safe then. And we, by participating in this with the group, it reinforces collectively our way of thinking. That's just one tiny aspect of
Yes.
so much religion, but it's still psychologically very important.
Yes. In other talks, I've emphasized what many theologians have tried to keep separate. I think it's important to see how they overlay, and that is the political and the religious. And that's because both have a sacred task, what I would call as a sacred task, and that is the gathering of a people. And in that activity, whether it's in the political or the religious form, you have narratives of origin. You have narratives of founders. You have narratives of heroism. You have, right? So what's going on there is the celebration of a people, of a gathering, which in itself is not absolute, but which rehearses a kind of identity and belonging, and therefore a sense of stability amidst a life of real change. I think what What's also important in what you're suggesting is that on the one hand, the processes of trust, of stability, as a basis then for risking ourselves, I think that is part of the human drama and the human reality. At the same time, progressive communities, really again over this 60-year kind of period, and even perhaps before then, of course, but progressive communities are those that value the prophetic, right? In other words, not just the priestly voice, which reassures us of our belonging, but a prophetic voice that calls us to a new space, that calls us to accountability for a kind of justice, that calls us out of ourselves. And that's what I think, again, a good view of the religious has to keep in mind. Not simply the priestly voice, but the prophetic. And it seems to me that those communities that are more self-consciously progressive have at least that kind of sensibility of a prophetic critique of the tradition. Someone the other night asked me a very good question. It was in Sydney. And they said, what's the downside? All theologies have a downside. What's the downside of this progressive theology? And I kind of stumbled around for it a little bit. But I think as I was thinking back on it in retrospect, a progressive theology can be as purist and as kind of narrow as, in fact, a more orthodox theology can be. And so I think the real challenge for those of us who are progressives is also to be open-ended to a range of voices and not simply lock into, well, here's the one purist response. Because one has to stay open to a kind of prophetic critique. We ourselves need to be open to saying, so it looks like you seem pretty sure of yourself in this, or like you're drawing these new lines. What I'm trying to draw attention to in my presentation here is a sense in which I have been called out by different theological positions and different people's experience to move my own sense of faith in new directions. But as I said at the outset, other people might be moving in just the opposite direction. They may have grown up in a very liberal home, in a very secular home, and they may be on a journey which is moving them more into a kind of Orthodox faith in a way that's genuinely transformative for them. So people are along different journeys, and I want to acknowledge that. At the same time, I think there's something important to the way in which this progressive theology, this voice of progressive theology, does keep pushing us out of ourselves. And I think that's important. Here's
I suspect most of us were raised in a Christian faith that was full of certainties. Yeah. There was a certain way to worship, there was a certain way to salvation, and that was it. And even recently I've met ministers who espouse the certainty of their way of doing it. I was very drawn at an early stage to the notion that was, I think, a French philosopher, which was, went like this, be drawn to those who ask the questions, beware of those who have the answers. Now that has actually led me into some very interesting discussions, one of which is, we've been doing the living the questions here a lot, and we really value the questions. And I would tell my students, the question is more important than the answer, and they would look at me rather strangely, because they would say, well, the questions lead to an answer, don't they? I said, yes, well, in science, the answer is never the end. There are many answers. And my question is, we are a group of people, progressive, who always ask the questions. Are all these questions leading us to a new certainty, or is the new certainty the fact that we are always asking questions?
Right. Great question. I'm sure there's a range of answers to that question in the room. But it's, no, it's, let me give you a quick discussion of theological method that goes to, in some ways, Paul Tillich, for example, famously describes what theologians do in terms of theological method. He said, theologians listen to the questions of a culture that come from philosophy, from the arts, from disciplines like psychology and others, and then the task of the theologian is to answer those questions in the form of the question. So if you've ever tried to read any of Paul Tillich and you say, boy, this reads like existential philosophy, that's why. He's trying to answer in the form of the question, right? But notice the question and answer formula he gives. David Tracy, my professor at the University of Chicago, brilliant professor in the field of hermeneutics, says, well, what we really are talking about is a mutually critical theory of relation, not of correlation, not question to answer, but he says it's mutually critical. And in that sense, he wants tradition to be critical of our lived sense of life, but he also knows that our lived sense of life and what we're learning from it needs to critique tradition as well. Hence the mutually critical. He's living in a time and teaching in a time when feminist theology has had to talk back to the tradition, or when liberationist theology has had to talk back to the tradition and say, well, wait a minute, right? Your model of God needs to be rethought. So for Tracy, there's that mutually critical model that complicates Tillich. My sense is more of a rhetorical model in which we are offering proposals. And what we have to do as theologians is we're offering differing proposals that, again, no one proposal is going to carry the day because of the range of complex issues that are on the table. But there are going to be lines, and this is part of the ongoing task of theology and also, I would say, of faith communities. This is why lay people, we have to democratize theology to make it more accessible to lay people. That's what I would love to try to do as well. So, but what happens is, as we listen to several of these different proposals, I do think, without trying to narrow into one solution, right, we can begin to steer communities of faith in directions that are actually life-giving and productive for our communities, not just individually, but also for the communities around us. Faith needs to be transformative for the world, not just for those of us who are in church. But it certainly needs to be transformative for us, even as we then try to say, right, the sacrality of our own life is moving out beyond the life of the church. It's engaging in communities beyond this one. So, yeah.
I'm surrounded by a family that is very religious, and I'm the only exception. I actually envy them, their complete knowledge that God is very definitely up there. They are comfortable, happy. I am seeking. Just your comments, at least
Sure.
be in a bit of a...
Sure. My family is in many ways in the same, I share a similar family. And in many ways, they don't really understand my life. They don't understand what I do in terms of studying. They really don't understand why, in some sense, I would move away from my tradition or what critiques I would have that would really move me to do that. And so, in some ways, they, and for their own reasons that I really don't want to judge, they find themselves to be comfortable in a more traditional expression of the faith. They are, several of them are involved in the life of their communities as readers or as singers in choir and that kind of thing. And so I think for some people that sense of ritual is a vital part of their own sense of securing. And so there is a securing impulse. And for many people, that impulse towards security that, again, that Caputo wants to open up and challenge, for many people that is what religion means, what faith means. And I certainly don't want to vilify that. But I don't like it when that language of security ends up being used to shut down issues of the equal dignity of women, or the equal dignity of gay and lesbian persons, or the equal dignity of persons of color, which quite frankly, at least in my country, traditional theologies have been used to do just that. And so at some point one wants to kind of, I want to honor the experience of my siblings and of other people. On the other hand, as somebody who teaches theology as a public discipline, where there are public consequences for the way in which we live and teach theology, ethically, epistemologically, what do we take science realistically or not? In the States, we're awful on this, quite frankly, with conservative religion. So there really are consequences, and I would say this is why I have very real reasons, and important ones in my view, for saying that faith needs to be a public discourse, not just a private one. It's not just about your private or my private goal to get to heaven. No, we have to face facts that religion is a powerful force in our world. And it needs to be steered like any powerful social force in the direction of justice rather than injustice, in the direction of knowledge rather than ignorance. And that, I think, is what I try to say, if I have an opening, to why I believe the way I do, and why I think theology needs to be a kind of discipline that grapples with public, difficult questions. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we in New Zealand have the intensity of religion, or it's such a high key thing over here compared to the States. You know, there's probably only a small percentage of people would go to church on a Sunday, so I just made that comment too. But yeah, I'd probably like to just peel away another layer of the onion, getting back to the sort of prayer issue, and just kind of some sort of thoughts on that. Jesus said, where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst, which is kind of, again, that sort of panentheistic kind of concept of sort of God.
Yeah.
You know, so when we get together we pray, we kind of are kind of almost sort of praying to one another in the sort of God in sort of one another, and bringing our thoughts to other people. So, for instance, if we might have a prayer that says, or you know, our wishes to a person that's going through some suffering or something, that we say our thoughts and our prayers are with you.
Yes.
You know, so it's just kind of like a sort of communal thing. So I sort of think the importance of sort of, and for my own life, you know, I've gone away from a lot of the personal prayer, but I find being able to sort of pray in a public sort of forum has a lot greater meaning, and for me personally, which kind of brings it into some of the thinking from, I don't know if you're familiar with a British biologist, Rupert Sheldrake, and his thinking. I know his and work he's kind of talking about this kind of consciousness that is kind of almost around the whole sort of planet, and when things are said and puzzles are sort of given to different species, not just even to humans but other species, you know, there is a speeding up of the solutions of those problems, which kind of, you know, speaks about this consciousness. So again, it's that sort of panentheistic sort of praying one to another, which, you know, I find sort of, you know, quite sort of helpful for myself. So.
Well, and I find some of that imagery also very helpful. Since being here in Australia and then here, so gone for 5 weeks. Laura's mom is in an assisted living facility, and so Laura's kind of monitoring her health. I learned that my brother had a detached retina as a side effect of a kind of surgery, and so again I'm finding myself saying and writing to my brother, you know, you're in my thoughts and prayers, right? And even though it's this what I mean by that language of prayer is I long for you to be well. I long for you to be whole. I feel this distance between us as something of a gulf that I can't cross. And so even here there is a language of God, whether it's of a kind of consciousness or of a kind of connective tissue. There is a sense of the holy or the sacred. Again, what I find helpful about Caputo is to say, once you begin to put a caller behind the call, then oftentimes you begin to put the supernatural power as someone who could, now I'm praying to intervene for this. And even as it seems to me that at that point I'm conscious that I might be going too far there, right? So here the theology is trying to inform my prayer life and try to kind of critique and say, is there a way in which when we are definitely praying for and with others, that we are tapping into something of our own sense of the sacred, sense of longing for the other, whether we know of this connective tissue or not. I think there are metaphors that we are reaching for, and I don't want to shut that down. But again, what I don't want is for when that religious language comes into play and say, well, I've talked to God, and here's why God tells me you're not welcome in this church. Or I've talked to God, and here I've gotten this revelation that I'm superior. Now at that point, we all have to think about, what are the messages from God that are, and this is why Caputo says it matters less if God exists or not. What really matters is what work is getting done under the name of God. What are you doing with that claim of God? Are you reaching out to others, or are you shutting them down? So in that sense, thank you. I think you're putting a proposal on the table for us to really think about. It's a creative one. But then the dangerous side is also something we want to be, as progressives especially, we want to be mindful of.
You're leaving us with a question, aren't you? I'm mindful of time. Is it urgent? One, right, last one.
When we're children, and we run into problems of one sort or another, we don't always seek help from our imaginary friends, but we seek help from our parents or the community we're in. When we become teenagers and we start to break that bond, as it were, we need a higher power, and we come with one built into us as adults, that we can appeal to a higher authority. Now, that's our instinctive pattern of behaviour. The quote, there are no atheists in shell holes. The point is that our culture provides us with the structure, the religion. Okay, their religion is just superstition. But if you explain to me the difference between superstition and religion, I think we might progress quite a long way.
Mm-hmm.
I think we might leave that as a question too.
Okay. Well, I'd be happy to do that if you'd like. That's fine. I do think that the impulse, that the religious impulse, is not simply one. This is why I was earlier trying to distinguish kind of the priestly from the prophetic. The religious impulse is not simply one of establishing order. It's also one of breaking open orders that we now also think to be unjust. Now, to be sure, religion is not the only discourse that can do that. But it is a discourse that's quite powerful, precisely because it taps into a sense of what is sacred, right? Of what is, as it were, at the heart of what it is we're about as people, or as, right? And so in that sense, I'd want us to keep thinking about the role of the sacred, even within a more, secular, within a more evolutionary kind of discourse. What does the sacred mean, and why does it continue to have a kind of evocative power? Don Cupid, when he was writing his 1981 book on Taking Leave of God, he drew on Kant's language of the kind of the ethical imperative. strikes me as very similar to what Caputo's doing in terms of there's a call. It's often ethical, and it's a kind of a call into responsibility. And that, I think, is something that where a sense of the sacred overlays our understanding of and kind of fits with our understanding of Darwin and of development. So, I mean, that to me is a provocative question that we can still spend a lot more time on. But thank you.
I'm going to hand this to Jock. It's all yours. You stand up and I'll
Well, Joe, it has fallen to my very pleasant duty to thank you most sincerely for widening our horizons. There would be quite a few of us here present, and also earlier today, who first came into contact with the thinking of and the work of the Jesus Seminar through Marcus Hall. He was a very useful gateway
Sure was.
to come to by which to approach new understandings and to get a sense of being on a quest, that the Christian faith should be it should be exciting. There should be we need to be challenged. We haven't got all the answers. We don't know where it's all going to end. But my word, we want to have, we want to be able to, especially at our age, or my age I should say, I want to know with some, what can I say? I need to feel that when I come to my deathbed, whatever position that I have, I will be able to hold it with some integrity. And I think that's important for us. And I just thank you, and I thank you for the work of the seminar, which has been a catalyst into removing some of the barriers, some of the tunnel vision, some of the narrow thinking and the literalism and so on that has been responsible for much unhappiness in the course of the last 2,000 years. So this was a little token of our appreciation, and thank you so much, and I hope the rest of your stay in New Zealand with you and Laura is really happy. And it's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much.
I want to say thank you to everyone for coming and wish you safe travelling. I'm sorry there is not a slap-up supper for you. I'm aware some of you need to travel, and so we made that decision, but thank you very much for you and Laura and Glyn.
Yeah.
Safe travelling. You probably travel the furthest, even if it's only back over. We call it over the Bombay Hills. That's where the Jaffas live. You can ask Glyn about that.
Thank you. Very good.